A new poll shows the top 2 issues battleground state voters are interested in and which candidate they think is better suited to handle those issues. KWWL's Witry sat down with our political analyst, Dr. Larimer, to break down that data.
Between now and Election Day, we're going to see a lot of polls, a lot of different numbers, all trying to tell us what's going to happen on election night. To help us clear out all those numbers, cut through the noise, is our chief political analyst, Dr. Larimer. Dr. Larimer, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for being with me.
So far the polls, showing a very tight race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, but there's one clear trend, and that is voters overwhelmingly want to see some change after November.
Yeah, there have been a couple of recent polls talking about that, and one of the recent polls comes from the New York Times Siena poll that was done the first week here in September. And one of the things they asked voters was, what kind of change do they want to see in this election cycle? Do they want to see major change or minor change? And what the poll showed is that 61% of voters want to see, quote, major change from this election. And then going forward, you have to ask yourself, okay, what does major change look like? And so what the poll did was then ask the voter, like these likely voters, again, this was a nationwide poll of likely voters, which candidate best represents major change? And in that poll, there was a clear advantage for former President Donald Trump. 53% of likely voters said they see Donald Trump as representing, quote, major change, compared to 25% for Vice President Kamala Harris. And that's not particularly surprising, given that Harris is part of the Biden-Harris administration. This is kind of a unique election cycle where you have someone running who's a new candidate, but still part of the current administration. And so voters, there's a clear direction there in terms of what voters want in terms of change, and which candidate they see as best representing, quote, major change.
And speaking about the issues, it seems like 2 issues have kind of risen to the top in terms of issues for the voters, and that's the economy and immigration. And it seems like each candidate has their own special lane for voters.
Yeah, and so the other thing that came out, there was another poll done by CNN that was done in the last week in August, and they were asking voters in battleground states. So they had 6 battleground states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and then Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia, asking those likely voters which issue is most important to them as they cast their vote for president. Now, it's typical that the economy is the #1 issue, and across those 6 states, on average, the economy was overwhelmingly the #1 issue, mentioned by, on average, about 39% of voters in those states. Number 2, though, was immigration. And immigration was mentioned on average by about 11.7% of voters in those 6 states. If you look at this poll, then that CNN poll in battleground of likely voters in battleground states, the next question there was, well, which candidate is better able to handle this issue of the economy, the issue that seems to be the #1 issue in this election cycle? And Donald Trump has an advantage over Kamala Harris by, on average, about 7 percentage points across these 6 states in the likely voters in these 6 battleground states. If you then move to the issue of immigration, the #2 issue of most concern for voters in these 6 states, Donald Trump actually has an 11.5 percentage point advantage over Vice President Kamala Harris. And so what we see in the poll reflects, what we saw in the debate on Tuesday night, in that we saw former President Donald Trump talking a lot about the economy, but in particular really emphasizing national security and trying to frame that discussion, talking about immigration, but trying to frame it in a way that brings in the issue of national security. We saw Vice President Harris trying to talk a little bit more about the economy, talking about some of the tax cuts she would do for the middle class, some of the breaks for small businesses. But again, I think what we're going to see going forward is that both candidates are going to emphasize the issues on which they see an advantage.
And as we enter the final 2 months of the campaign here, how do you think the Harris and Trump campaigns are going to tackle those top issues?
Well, I think we'll continue to see former President Donald Trump talking about immigration, but talking about it in a way that relates to national security. And again, I think for Vice President Harris, she's already started to talk more about the economy, talk about how she can relate better to voters and understand their concerns related to the economy, because on that issue, it may be an easier way to break in and cut down that 7 to 8 point advantage that Donald Trump had among likely voters in that poll. And that could be something where she sees going forward where she can make up a little bit of ground.